Clara Whitmore didn't cry when they cut her hair. She stood in the dark kitchen of the home her father had built, scissors scraping against her neck, and she made herself a promise she would not break. Not tonight. Not in front of them. If this story moves you, if you've ever been made to feel like you were nothing, subscribe to this channel, stay until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Margaret Whitmore decided to ruin her stepdaughter started the same way every morning at the Whitmore farm. Started quietly with birdsong and the smell of wood smoke from a fire. Clara had already risen at 4 o'clock to light. Clara was always first awake. She had been first awake since she was 9 years old when her mother died, and her father Robert Whitmore had wept so hard at the kitchen table that she had climbed up onto the bench beside him, taken his hand in both of hers and said, "I'll take care of everything, Papa. I promise." She had kept that promise for 15 years. She kept it through the long winters when the livestock took sick and she slept in the barn to watch over the animals. She kept it through the droughts when she rationed the well water down to the cupful and never once complained. She kept it through her father's second marriage to Margaret Hale, a widow from Lexington, with 2 trunks full of fine dresses and a daughter named Eleanor, who had never in her life been asked to carry her own weight. Clara kept her promise right up until the morning. Her father was buried when Margaret folded her hands on the kitchen table, looked across at her stepdaughter and said, "Things are going to be different now." Clara had nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She had not understood then what different meant. She understood it now. She understood it as she knelt on the cold floor, scrubbing the hearthstone, while Eleanor ate breakfast at the table Clara had cooked. She understood it when Margaret handed her a dress so threadbare the elbows had worn through and told her that was all she'd be needing. She understood it when the farmhands men who had worked alongside her father for 20 years stopped meeting her eyes in the yard, because Margaret had told them that Clara was nobody, now that the farm belonged to the family, and Clara was simply help. Help. In the house her father built with his own hands. Clara didn't fight it. Not at first. She told herself that grief did strange things to people, that Margaret would settle, that Eleanor would eventually show some small grace. She worked harder, she cooked better, she stayed out of the way and asked for nothing, and hoped in the particular desperate way that only the truly powerless can hope that being good enough would eventually be enough. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. She understood that fully on the evening Margaret called her into the front parlor, the parlor Clara's mother had once decorated with dried wildflowers in the summer, and sat across from her with Eleanor perched on the settee, a small scissors glinting in Eleanor's hand. "Sit down, Clara," Margaret said. Clara sat. "We've had a communication," Margaret said, "from the Carter estate." Clara knew the name. Everyone in 2 counties knew the name. Nathaniel Carter owned the largest working farm in Tennessee. He had served in the War of 1812, come back with a scar along his jaw and a reputation for fairness and hard dealing in equal measure. He was 36 years old, unmarried, and had more land than any one man could reasonably manage. He was also, by all accounts, not the sort of man who suffered fools. "He's looking for household help," Margaret continued. "Competent help. Someone who can manage a kitchen and assist with the running of a large estate." Clara kept her face still. "And you're sending me?" "It's a good position," Margaret said in the tone of a woman granting a great favor. "It's a good position for you," Clara said before she could stop herself. "You'd have one less mouth to feed." Margaret's expression didn't change. That was the thing about Margaret. She never showed anger where someone could use it against her. She simply reached across and took Eleanor's hand, and Eleanor handed her the scissors without being asked. "Your hair," Margaret said, "has always drawn attention. Men look at you because of it. It gives you ideas above your station. We feel it would be better, more appropriate for a girl going into service if it were shorter." Clara looked at the scissors. She looked at Eleanor, who was watching her with wide, bright eyes that Clara had always privately thought held very little actual light. She looked at Margaret. "No," Clara said. It was the first time in 2 years she had said that word in this house, and the sound of it surprised even her. Margaret tilted her head. "I beg your pardon." "No," Clara said again. "My hair is mine. It was my mother's before me. She had the same color, and my father loved it, and I will not." She stopped because Margaret had stood up, and Eleanor had stood up, and Clara was sitting down, and she was alone, and she had run out of people in the world who were on her side. She didn't move when Margaret stepped behind her. She didn't speak. She stared at the wall and thought about her father, about the wildflowers her mother had dried and pressed and hung in this room that no longer had any of those flowers in it. And she made herself very still and very quiet, the way she had learned to be. The scissors were cold against her neck. Eleanor giggled once and then covered her mouth. When it was done, Margaret walked around to stand in front of her and looked at her the way a person looks at a task that has been adequately completed. "There," she said. "Now you look appropriate." Clara didn't touch her hair. She didn't trust what she would do if she touched it. "You'll leave Thursday morning," Margaret said. "I've written to Carter with your particulars. Don't embarrass this family." Clara looked up at her, and she felt something shift behind her eyes. Not tears. She would not give hers, but something colder and more certain, like a door closing on a room that would never be warm again. "I wouldn't dream of it," she said. She left before Thursday. She left on Wednesday, in the gray hour before the sun came up, with a single bag and the dress she was wearing, and the knowledge that if she stayed one more night in that house, she would do something she could not take back. The road to Tennessee was long and rough, and she walked the first 4 miles before a farm wagon heading south stopped for her. The man driving, an older fellow with a kind face and a load of timber, took one look at her and said nothing about her hair, just offered her a place on the bench beside him and asked if she'd eaten. She had not eaten since the previous morning. He gave her bread and a piece of hard cheese from his pack, and they rode in silence, which was exactly what she needed. She did not cry on this wagon. She had promised herself she would not cry, and Clara Whitmore had a long history of keeping her promises. The Carter farm was larger than she had imagined, and she had imagined it considerable. She came up the drive in the early afternoon of the next day, having spent the night at a roadside inn with the 3 coins she'd kept sewn into the hem of her mother's old apron. The only thing of her mother's she'd been allowed to keep, and only because Margaret hadn't thought to look there. The drive was lined with old oaks, and the house at the end of it was not a grand thing by Virginia standards, not the sort of house that tried to announce its importance. It was a working house built for function, big and solid, and set into the land like it intended to stay. There were people moving in the yard. A man repairing a fence post. 2 women beating a rug hung over a rail. A young boy carrying a bucket who stopped to stare at her openly. Clara squared her shoulders and walked to the front of the house. She knocked. A woman in her 50s answered a housekeeper by the look of her, iron-haired and sharp-eyed, and looked at Clara from the top of her bare head to the toes of her worn shoes. "You'd be the Whitmore girl," she said. "Yes, ma'am, Clara Whitmore. I was told there was a position. You look like you walked here." "I rode part of the way." The housekeeper's gaze moved to Clara's hair. She said nothing about it. "Come in then. Mr. Carter will want to speak with you himself." That surprised her. She had not expected to be received by the man himself. She had expected a housekeeper's interview, perhaps a trial in the kitchen, some kind of audition for a place at the bottom of a long ladder. She had prepared herself for that. She had not prepared herself for Nathaniel Carter. Howe was in the study, standing at the window with his back to the door, reading something. He turned when the housekeeper announced her, and Clara had a moment to take him in before he did the same to her. Howe was tall, not imposing in the showy way of men who knew they were tall, but simply big the way working men were big, with the kind of stillness that came from having seen enough of the world that you didn't need to fill a room with noise. The scar along his jaw was exactly where the stories put it. His eyes were dark brown, and he had the habit she would learn later of going very still when he was taking something in the way an animal does when it's not yet decided whether a thing is a threat. Howe was very still now. His eyes moved to her hair. Not in the way Eleanor had looked at her hair with satisfaction, with the particular pleasure of a small cruelty completed, but in the way a man looked at something wrong. Like seeing a fence post knocked over. Like something that should be standing was on the ground. He said, "Who did this to you?" Clara had prepared answers for many questions. She had prepared an account of her skills, a mention of her experience managing a household, a careful, not quite lie about why she had left the Whitmore farm. She had prepared herself to be asked about references, about wages, about the kind of work she was willing to do. She had not prepared for that question asked in that tone, and for one terrible moment, she felt something dangerous unlock behind her sternum. She breathed through it. "It doesn't matter, sir," she said. "I'm here about the position." He didn't move away from this window. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he was reading something she hadn't intended to show. "It matters to me," he said. "I'd rather discuss my qualifications." Another pause. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if he'd decided to let her have that for now. "All right. Tell me about yourself, Miss Whitmore," she told him. She told him about the Whitmore farm, the size of it, the running of it, the kitchen management, and the livestock records, and the household accounts she had kept since she was 14. She told him about the sickness that had moved through the county 3 winters past, and how she had nursed 6 of their farm hands back to health when the doctor was 3 days away. She told him she could manage a kitchen for any number that she did not easily rattle that she expected to earn her keep, and nothing more. She did not tell him about the scissors. She did not tell him about the parlor, or the dress she had been given, or the 2 years of being made to feel like a ghost in her father's house. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not what she'd expected. Most men in her experience stopped listening about 30 seconds in and started nodding as a substitute. When she finished, he said, "Why'd you leave?" Clara met his eyes. "My father passed 18 months ago. The farm went to his wife. I decided it was time to find a position." It was the most honest lie she'd ever told. He nodded again. "Mrs. Calloway will show you the kitchen. We'll see how you do at supper." "Thank you, sir." She turned to go. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "You'll have your own room," he said. "And you won't be spoken to the way whoever spoke to you before spoke to you. That won't happen here." She didn't turn around. She couldn't just then. "Yes, sir," she said, and followed Mrs. Calloway down the hall. She made supper that first evening for 14 people, Nathaniel the housekeeper, and 12 farmhands with a kitchen. She'd never worked in a pantry. She'd spent 20 minutes inventorying and absolutely no intention of failing. She made a venison stew with the dried herbs she found hanging near the hearth, and fresh bread she had to coax out of a temperamental oven, and a dried apple cake sweetened with the last of someone's stored honey. She did it without asking a single question. She didn't have to ask, because she had learned that asking questions in unfamiliar places made people uncertain of you, and she needed these people to be certain of her. The kitchen girl, a 15-year-old named Hattie with a gap-toothed grin and more energy than sense, watched her work with open amazement. "You really do know what you're doing," Hattie said, as if this were unexpected. "I really do," Clara confirmed. "Mrs. Calloway was worried you were some kind of charity case. She didn't say it, but I could tell." "I'm not a charity case, Hattie." "No, ma'am." Hattie stirred the stew thoughtfully. "What happened to your hair?" Clara took the bread out of the oven. "I had it cut." "It looks like somebody else cut it." "Hattie." "Yes, ma'am." "Stir that stew." "Yes, ma'am." 14 men sat down to supper that evening, and when they tasted the stew, there was a silence. First, the particular silence of men who had not expected to be surprised, and then something loosened around the table. Someone laughed. Someone asked for more bread before the basket had made it halfway around. Old Tom, the fence mender she'd seen that afternoon, looked down at his bowl and said, "Lord Almighty," in a tone of genuine religious feeling. Nathaniel Carter said nothing during supper, but afterward, when the men had gone back out, and Hattie was washing up, and Mrs. Calloway was organizing the pantry, he came to the kitchen doorway. Clara was wiping down the long table. "How'd you know," he said, "that Tom likes his pepper heavy?" She glanced up. He rubbed his jaw when he sat down. Men with joint trouble favor strong spice. It helps the blood move. He looked at her for a moment. "Where'd you learn that?" "Taking care of people, sir." How was quiet for a beat. Then, "You'll do Miss Whitmore." "Yes, sir," she said. "I know." A corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile, But it was the first one she'd seen him come close to, and she filed it away without knowing why. She learned the rhythms of the Carter farm, the way she had always learned things by watching, by working, by being more useful than anyone had anticipated. Within a week, she had reorganized the kitchen stores and quietly fixed a water heating problem that Mrs. Calloway had been tolerating for a year. Within 2 weeks, the farmhands had stopped eyeing her with the wariness men have for newcomers, and had started asking her things: what to do about a cough, what to put on a burn, whether she had more of that bread. She gave them what she had. That was the only way she knew how to be. What she noticed about Nathaniel Carter was that he watched without appearing to watch. He was the kind of man who could be across a yard and still see what was happening at the kitchen door. He was fair with his men. She heard enough to know that, and hard, but not unkind. And he had the particular quality of a man who said exactly what he meant, and expected others to do the same. She also noticed that Eleanor Whitmore's name had been mentioned in the only letter that had arrived from the Whitmore farm since her departure. She had not been in the room when the letter was delivered, but Mrs. Calloway had mentioned it offhand, the way housekeepers mention things they thought were none of their business, but felt they ought to note, and Clara had understood immediately what Margaret was doing. Margaret was still trying. She had sent Clara away to keep her out of Nathaniel Carter's sight, and now she was writing to put Eleanor into it. Clara stood in the kitchen with that knowledge sitting in her chest like a stone, and she thought, all right. She thought, let her try. She thought with a coldness that surprised her, I am not afraid of Eleanor Whitmore. And she wasn't. That was the thing she had not expected about coming here, that this place, this house, this man who asked questions in that quiet, particular way of his, had done something she hadn't asked for. It had given her back a small edge of herself. Not all of it, but enough. The evening. It changed, the evening that moved things from careful and contained into something neither of them had planned, was 3 weeks into her time at the Carter farm on a Tuesday in late June, when the air was thick and still and storm-promising. She had gone out to the herb garden after supper to gather what she needed for a poultice. Old Tom's joints had worsened in the humidity, and she wanted to have something ready for him, and she was crouched down between the rosemary rows when she heard footsteps on the path behind her. She didn't startle. She had stopped startling easily around the time she'd started expecting nothing good from footsteps behind her. But it was Nathaniel. He came to stand at the edge of the garden and looked at what she was gathering. Tom's joints. Yes, sir. She glanced up. How'd you know? He was limping worse at noon. You watch people the same way I do. He said it matter-of-factly, without particular warmth or coldness. Clara sat back on her heels. I had to learn to watch people. It was how I knew what was coming. She hadn't meant to say that. It came out before she caught it, and she looked back down at the rosemary and hoped he wouldn't press it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I got a letter from a Mrs. Whitmore. Clara kept her hands steady. Is that so? She tells me her daughter is an excellent candidate for a household position. That her late husband's ward. He paused. She called you a ward, Miss Whitmore. I know what she called me. You're not a ward. You're his daughter. Clara looked up at him. It was the first time anyone outside of herself had said that plainly, and the simplicity of it cracked something loose in her chest. Yes, sir, she said. She says her daughter Eleanor has experience in household management. Eleanor has experience in asking other people to manage things for her, Clara said before she could stop it. There was a pause. Then Nathaniel said, I gathered as much. Clara looked at him. You're not going to offer her the position. No, he said. He said it the same way he said most things, level and final, like a door closing gently but firmly. I'm not in the habit of hiring people on the recommendation of someone I don't trust. You don't know Margaret Whitmore. No, he said. But I know the cut of a woman who sent another woman out of her home with her hair hacked off and called it appropriate. He paused. That tells me enough. Clara was quiet for a long moment. The storm was moving closer. She could smell the rain in the air, feel the change in pressure, and in the garden. Everything was very still and very alive. At the same time, the way things get just before the weather turns. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. Because I thought you should know that whatever was done to you before you came here is not the truth of you. And whatever that woman writes about you in letters, it won't change what I've seen. Clara looked down at her hands. The herbs, the dark soil. She thought about the parlor, the scissors, Eleanor's small giggle, the way Margaret had said there like a task completed, and how Clara had felt like something that had been deliberately diminished, carefully reduced, made smaller, so she would take up less room in the world. She thought about Nathaniel Carter standing at the window the first afternoon, going still when he saw her, and asking who did this to you, in a tone that contained no pity, only what outrage may be. The steady, practical outrage of a man who saw a wrong thing and named it. It helps, she said at last. What you said, it helps. He nodded once, that was all. He left her to her gathering, and the storm came in just after dark and soaked the yard clean, and Clara sat by the kitchen window, watching the rain, and held very carefully to that small new edge of herself. What she did not know, could not know from her place in the kitchen, was what Nathaniel Carter sat with that same night in his study, with the letter from Margaret Whitmore on the desk in front of him. He had read it twice. He had noted the language carefully, the phrasing chosen to diminish without overtly accusing the way it positioned Eleanor as a solution, and Clara as a complication, the particular kind of document written by a person who believed they were smarter than they were. He had been in the war. He had known commanding officers who communicated exactly this way, men who had the instinct of a predator and the language of a bureaucrat. He was not fooled by that language then, and he was not fooled by it now. He set the letter aside and thought about Clara Whitmore crouched in the herb garden with her bare hands in the soil and her short hair curling at the nape of her neck in the humidity. And the way she had said it helps in a voice that was working very hard to remain steady. And he thought, this is not over. Whatever had been done to that woman, it was not over. How was not a man who involved himself in other people's troubles without reason? He had learned in the war. In the years after that, the world had more suffering than one man could remedy, and that trying to remedy too much of it left you emptied out and useless for the smaller tasks that actually needed doing. But he was also, and this was perhaps the most essential thing about Nathaniel Carter, a man who could not look at a wrong thing and call it something else. He picked up the letter. He thought for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. Margaret Whitmore received his reply 4 days later. She read it standing in the hallway with Eleanor at her shoulder, and the color drained from her face in a way that Eleanor found momentarily alarming. "What does it say?" Eleanor asked. Margaret folded the letter precisely. "He's not interested in additional household help at this time," she said. "But I thought, I'm handling it, Eleanor." "Mama," I said, "I'm handling it." Margaret walked to the parlor and closed the door behind her. Eleanor stood in the hall and looked at the closed door and had the dim, uncomfortable sense, not for the first time, that something had not gone quite the way her mother had planned. What neither of them knew was what Nathaniel Carter had written. What he had written was this: he was not interested in additional household help. He was, however, interested in the matter of the Whitmore Farms land deed, which he had reason to believe might warrant some review. As a man with certain connections to the county recorder's office, he would be grateful for Mrs. Whitmore's understanding should that review require her documentation of the transfer of property following the late Mr. Whitmore's passing. He had closed it with his name. He had folded it himself. He had sent his most reliable man to deliver it. And then he had gone back to his desk and sat for a long time in the particular stillness of a man who has committed to something he knows will cost him. The Whitmore Farms deed. He had no reason to look at the Whitmore Farms deed. No reason, except that he'd hired a woman who was introduced to him as a ward when she was a daughter who'd arrived with her hair cut off and her eyes like someone who had learned to expect the worst, who had in 3 weeks organized his kitchen and healed his farmhand and fed 14 people every evening, like she was trying to give them something they didn't know they needed, and who had said in a voice carefully stripped of everything except the bare truth it helps, how was not a sentimental man. He didn't pretend to be. But he was a thorough one. And something about Clara Whitmore made him want for the first time in a very long while to be thorough. She didn't know that night or the nights following what he had done. She only knew that the expected second letter from Margaret did not arrive. She only knew that she woke each morning in her own small room. Her own room, the first in 2 years, and the day ahead of her was a day she had earned. She knew that Tom's joints were improving. She knew that Hattie had started without being asked to write down the recipes Clara taught her. She knew that when she walked through the kitchen at any hour, the farm hands stepped out of her way with a respect she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, and was learning slowly and carefully to accept as her due. She knew, though she would not have said it aloud to anyone, that she slept better in this house than she had slept in 2 years. She knew that Nathaniel Carter had told her something true and plain when he did not have to, and that she had not forgotten it. She held these things carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile, the way you hold something that you are not certain yet is really yours to keep. But she held them, and she did not let go. The thing about earning your place somewhere was that you never quite stopped earning it. You just got better at hiding how hard the work was. Clara understood that. She had understood it since she was 9 years old, and she understood it now in the Carter kitchen at 5 in the morning, with the fire already built, and the first bread already rising, and Hattie still asleep in the room above. She understood it the way she understood breathing, not because she thought about it, but because stopping was not a choice she had available to her. What she had not understood coming here was that being seen could be as unsettling as being invisible. At the Whitmore farm, invisibility had been survival. The less she existed in Margaret's line of sight, the less Margaret could take from her. She had made herself small and useful and quiet, and it had not saved her. It had never been going to save her, but it had at least made the damage manageable. Here she could not be invisible. And it was Nathaniel Carter who made invisibility impossible, not through anything dramatic or deliberate, but simply by paying attention. He noticed the bread. He noticed when the farm hands were eating better and sleeping harder because she'd improved the evening meal. He noticed when old Tom walked easier and asked her quietly and without fanfare what she'd given him and whether she had enough of it. He had a specific watchful quality that she had originally found unnerving and had since come to realize was simply who he was. A man built for exactness, for seeing what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. It should have made her feel safer. On the mornings when she lay awake before the fire needed lighting and thought about it honestly, she admitted that it did. But it also made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated, like a window she'd kept shuttered. Her whole life was being opened by someone who was only trying to let in light and had no idea how long it had been dark in there. She managed it the way she managed most things. She worked harder. She kept moving. She did not dwell. That worked right up until the morning Nathaniel came into the kitchen while she was alone. It was earlier than his usual hour, and she was standing at the long table rolling out pastry dough for the midday meal, and he came in and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd left on the hearth and stood at the other end of the table and said without any preamble, "Tell me about your father." Clara's hand stilled on the dough. She looked up at him. "Why?" she said. "Because you mention everything in this house," he said. "The kitchen, the farm hands, the herb garden, the supply orders. Mrs. Calloway's knee that bothers her in the mornings. You mention everything except yourself." "I'm here to work, Mr. Carter, not to talk about myself." "I'm not asking as your employer," he said. That stopped her. She looked at him across the table, and he was looking back at her with that particular stillness of his, the kind that said he was not going to be redirected by politeness. "How was a good man," she said finally. "He was a farmer, and he worked hard, and he loved my mother until she died, and he was the kind of father who remembered small things. What you said you wanted for your birthday 6 months before, the name of the girl at church you'd mentioned liking. Small things." She stopped. He deserved better than what happened to him. "What happened to him? He got lonely," she said. "After my mother. And Margaret was—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Available." Nathaniel was quiet. "She was kind to him," Clara said. "Before the wedding. After the wedding, she was a different thing entirely. But he was sick by then, and I think he knew toward the end that he'd made a mistake, and it grieved him. I think it grieved him more than the illness." She went back to the dough. Her hands moved. The pastry flattened slowly. "He left the farm to me," she said. "He told me so. He told me 3 separate times, the last time a week before he died. He said, 'Clara, the Whitmore land is yours.' He said, 'I've seen to it.' He said, 'Don't let anyone tell you different.'" The room was very quiet. "But someone told you different," Nathaniel said. "Someone showed me a document," Clara said. "A will, with my father's signature on it. And," she pressed the dough down flat. "My father was left-handed," she said. "He signed everything with his left hand. The signature on that document was made by someone who was trying to copy a left-handed signature from the right. The angle was wrong. The pressure was wrong." She had known since the day Margaret showed her that document. She had stood in that parlor and looked at her father's forged name and known completely and without any possibility of doubt exactly what had been done. And she had said nothing. Because she was alone, and Margaret had the document, and Clara had nothing. She looked up and found Nathaniel watching her. "You knew," he said, "from the start." "Yes." "And you couldn't prove it?" "No." He set down his coffee cup. "You can now," he said. She stared at him. "I wrote to the county recorder's office," he said. "The week after you arrived. I requested a review of the Whitmore estate transfer documents. I have a contact there, a man I served with who's been in that office 12 years. He wrote back yesterday." Clara's hands had stopped moving entirely. "He found 2 documents," Nathaniel said. "One filed in the standard record after your father's death naming Margaret Whitmore as sole inheritor. And one filed 6 weeks before your father's death, an earlier filing naming a Clara R. Whitmore as primary heir to the Whitmore farm and land." The kitchen went absolutely still. "That document," Nathaniel said, "was filed with your father's left-handed signature." Clara gripped the edge of the table. She didn't speak. She couldn't right then. She stood with both hands flat on the table, and she breathed and she thought about her father, about his voice saying, "Don't let anyone tell you different," about how much it had cost him to say it when he was already too weak to say much of anything. And she thought he did. He saw to it. He kept his promise. Margaret had simply found the document and filed another one on top of it. "Clara," Nathaniel said. She looked up. His face was even the way it usually was, but there was something in his eyes that she had not seen there before. Not pity. She was grateful. It wasn't pity. Something quieter and more serious. "You're not a ward," he said. "You never were. That farm is yours." She had known it. She had known it for 2 years. Hearing it said plainly with evidence behind it was something else entirely. "All right," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "All right, what do we do?" Nathaniel looked at her for a moment, and something she would not call it warmth. He was not a warm man in the obvious way, but something shifted in his expression. "We take it back," he said. The thing Margaret had not accounted for, Clara thought later, was that she had been too successful at making Clara invisible. She had spent 2 years ensuring Clara was seen as nobody. A ward. A charity case. A girl with no standing and no allies and nothing to her name. She had done it so thoroughly and told the story so consistently to so many people in 2 counties that she had stopped watching for the possibility that Clara was doing anything except enduring. She had not considered the possibility that Clara was watching back. But Clara had been watching for a long time. She had watched Margaret's habits, her methods, her relationships. She had watched which men in the county Margaret cultivated and why. She had watched the farmhands who had worked her father's land for decades, men who had known Robert Whitmore, who had respected him, who had not forgotten what he'd built. She had kept a list in her head. She had not been able to do anything with that list when she was at the Whitmore farm and alone. But she was not alone now. She told Nathaniel about the list, and he listened to all of it in the study. This time the 2 of them at opposite ends of his desk with the recorder's letter between them. "There's a man named Harlan Webb," she said. "He's worked the Whitmore land for 22 years. He was with my father the last month of his life. He was in the house the week my father told me the land was mine. He heard it." Would he say so? If he was asked by someone, he couldn't be pressured into silence by yes. She paused. He's afraid of Margaret. She's made things difficult for his family, but he's not afraid of her the way he'd be afraid of you." A beat of silence. "That's not a compliment," she added quickly. "I know," he said. Something close to dry humor moved across his face. "You meant it practically." "I meant that he would talk to you where he wouldn't talk to me." Nathaniel nodded. He picked up a pen and wrote the name at the top of a blank sheet. "Who else?" she told him. She told him about the household accounts she had personally kept for 3 years, which were in a ledger she had last seen in the Whitmore house's back study. She told him about her father's solicitor in Harrodsburg, a man named Garrett, who had drawn up her father's original will, and who Margaret had never managed to fully co-opt because he was old and stubborn and had his own reputation to protect. She told him about 3 her father had written her and given her directly. Letters she had kept folded inside the lining of her mother's apron, the same apron with the coins sewn into the hem, because it was the one thing Margaret had never searched. Nathaniel looked at her when she mentioned the apron. "You've been carrying them since you left," he said. "Since he gave them to me," she corrected. 2 years. He said nothing, but he set down the pen for a moment, and the quality of his silence was different from his usual silence. More careful. Like someone handling something they understood to be fragile. "I'll ride to Harrodsburg," he said. "I have business there in any case. I'll speak to Garrett." "He won't talk easily." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But I'm patient." She believed him. She had never met a man who wore patience the way he wore it, not as virtue, not as discipline, but simply as nature. Like patience was the water table beneath him, always there, always sufficient, never needing to announce itself. "There's one more thing," she said. He looked at her. "Eleanor is coming here," she said. "Margaret will send her. She already tried once with the letter and you turned that down, but Eleanor is—" She stopped. "Eleanor is not stupid. She is entirely her mother's instrument, but she is not stupid. She'll find another approach." Nathaniel studied her. "What do you want me to do about that?" "Nothing," Clara said. "I want to know you won't be surprised by it." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I don't surprise easily," he said. "No," she agreed. "I've noticed." Eleanor arrived 12 days later. She arrived not with a letter of inquiry, but with her mother's social connection, specifically with Mrs. Pryor, the wife of the county magistrate, who had the habit of calling on Nathaniel twice a year in what everyone understood to be a social arrangement, and what Nathaniel endured with the particular patience of a man who understood that magistrates were useful. Mrs. Pryor called with Eleanor in tow, introduced her as a dear family friend who happened to be visiting from Kentucky, and stayed for precisely long enough to make the introduction feel natural. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. She watched Eleanor look around the Carter house with the particular assessment of a woman calculating what she might stand to gain. She watched Eleanor find Nathaniel across the room and smile the smile she had been deploying since she was old enough to understand its effect. She was beautiful. Eleanor Clara had never been able to deny that. She had her mother's coloring and none of her mother's visible coldness, because Eleanor had learned young that warmth was more useful than coldness when you were trying to get something you wanted. She watched Nathaniel receive the introduction with the polite, closed courtesy he applied to most things he had not sought out. And then Eleanor's eyes swept the room and found Clara in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor's smile shifted. It didn't disappear, Eleanor was too practiced for that, but it tightened. Something moved behind her eyes that was the same thing Clara had seen in the parlor with the scissors. That particular calculation. Then Eleanor looked away and laughed at something Mrs. Pryor said, and the moment passed. Clara went back into the kitchen. Hattie was watching her. "Who's the pretty one?" "Someone I used to know," Clara said. "She's staring at Mr. Carter." "Most women do." "Not you," Hattie said. Clara picked up the bread paddle. "I'm busy, Hattie." "I've noticed that about you," Hattie said, undeterred. "You're always too busy to notice when men look at you." "Men don't." "Mr. Carter does," Hattie said simply, and then turned back to the fire like she hadn't just said anything remarkable. Clara did not respond to that. She was not going to respond to that. there was bread to manage, and a midday meal to coordinate, and she had exactly no business thinking about the way Nathaniel Carter looked at her, or didn't look at her, because she was here on the basis of her work and her need, and the fragile, still-forming fact of her own legal claim to her future, and she was not going to complicate that. She was not going to complicate that. She repeated it to herself firmly, and set about not thinking about it, which occupied considerably more mental energy than she cared to admit. Eleanor stayed for tea. Of course she did. Clara managed the tea tray herself because Hattie was 17 and prone to nerves, and she carried it into the front room with her back straight and her face even and set it on the table without looking at Eleanor or at Nathaniel or at anyone, except the teapot, which was her one reliable friend in that room. "Oh," Eleanor said, and her voice was the same voice it had always been, smooth and pretty and containing underneath it something with teeth. "Clara." "Miss Whitmore," Clara said. Eleanor laughed lightly. "You needn't be so formal. We're practically sisters." "We are not sisters," Clara said. The temperature in the room dropped a degree or two. Mrs. Pryor glanced between them. Nathaniel, who was standing at the side of the room, had gone very still. "Of course," Eleanor said. "I only meant we grew up together practically. I've always thought of you as family." "I know what you've thought of me," Clara said. She poured the tea. Her hands were steady. "Milk, Mrs. Pryor." "Please," Mrs. Pryor said in the slightly elevated tone of a woman anxious to restore social equilibrium. Eleanor leaned forward. "Your hair," she said softly. "It's grown out a bit. It suits you." Clara looked at her. There were a number of things Clara could have said. She had in the 2 years at the Whitmore farm, and the weeks since run through many of them in her mind, during the long hours when she had nothing but her own thoughts and the particular silence of waiting. She had imagined confrontations, accusations, the precise and devastating thing she would say when she was finally able to say it. But she looked at Eleanor Whitmore now, with her pretty face, and her mother's planning behind her eyes, and she felt with a clarity that surprised her that she did not need to say any of them. Not yet. Not here in this room where the power was not yet fully hers. "Thank you," Clara said. She finished pouring the tea and walked out of the room. She heard behind her Eleanor begin to laugh, the laugh of a woman performing ease for an audience. She heard Nathaniel say nothing, and she thought wait. She thought patience. She thought with a certainty that was new to her and solid beneath her, like good ground, it is coming. He found her in the kitchen afterward. She was washing up because washing up was something she could do with her hands, and her hands needed to be doing something. "You handled that well," he said. "I handled it," she said. "I wouldn't say well." "You didn't say anything you'd regret?" "No." She scrubbed at the pan. "I wanted to." "I know." He paused. "So did I." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning in the doorway, not coming in, not leaving, just occupying the threshold in the way he sometimes did when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "She'll come back," Clara said. "Yes." "Her mother sent her." "Yes." "And you're going to—" "Let her try," he said evenly. "And watch what she does. And when the time comes, I'll know who she is and what she's willing to do. That's useful." Clara thought about this. "You're using her to understand Margaret." "Margaret sent her to get information. It works the same direction." She turned back to the pan. "You're a careful man, Mr. Carter." "In my experience," he said, "careful men outlast careless ones." She considered that. "My father wasn't a careful man. Not about people. He trusted too easily." "And you learned from that." "I learned," she said, "that you can be too careful. That you can be so careful you don't trust anyone, and then you're just—" She stopped. "Alone. And alone is survivable. But it's not—" She scrubbed harder at the pan. "It's not much." She heard him move, and when she looked up, he was no longer in the doorway. He had stepped into the kitchen, and he was standing across the table from her. And there was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before. Not the careful evenness, not the watching patience, but something more direct and more unguarded, the way a man looks when he has decided to say the true thing instead of the useful thing. "No," he said. "It's not much." She looked at him. "I was careful for a long time," he said. "After the war, lost men who mattered to me came back to land, and no one in it, and told myself that was enough. That things I could work and build and hold in my hands, that was enough." "And now," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "Now I think I may have been too careful," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara's hands were still in the wash basin. She thought about what to do with that, what to say, whether to say anything at all, and she looked at this man who had taken in a stranger with her hair cut off and asked, "Who did this?" Like it mattered who had written to the county recorder's office the week she arrived without telling her who had said, "Your father's land is yours," and made it sound like a fact he was prepared to back up. She thought, "This is the kind of man my father would have liked." She thought, "Don't complicate this." She thought, "It is already complicated." "Tom's knee is better," she said, because she was Clara Whitmore, and she had spent 24 years learning to step away from the edge of things before she fell off. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth moved. "Good," he said. He turned to go. "Mr. Carter." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For Harrodsburg, for the recorder's office, for," she stopped because the list was too long to say in a kitchen, "for all of it." He turned back just enough to see her. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "It's not done." "No," she agreed. "But it started." He looked at her for one more moment, long enough that she felt it somewhere behind her ribs, and then he walked out, and Clara stood in the kitchen with her hands still in the basin, and she held very carefully to the ground beneath her feet. And she told herself it was fine. Everything was fine. She was fine. She was not entirely certain she was telling herself the truth. 3 days after Eleanor's visit, Mrs. Calloway brought Clara a sealed letter. Not from Margaret this time. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar. Formal, careful, the script of someone who had learned to write for professional purposes. She opened it in her room. It was from Edward Garrett, solicitor of Harrodsburg, Kentucky. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph established his identity and his long professional relationship with the late Robert Whitmore. The second paragraph noted that he had recently received a visit from a Mr. Nathaniel Carter of Tennessee, and that Mr. Carter had raised certain questions regarding the administration of Robert Whitmore's estate that Mr. Garrett found himself in a position to address. The third paragraph said, "I am in possession of a complete original of your father's will, signed in his own hand, witnessed by 2 members of my staff, and dated 8 months prior to his death. I have kept this document in my private records at the request of your father, who expressed to me his concern that it might be, and I quote him directly, misplaced, should it be left at the farm. I am prepared to present this document at any appropriate legal proceeding. Please advise at your earliest convenience." Clara read it twice. She sat on the edge of her bed in her small room, and she held the letter in both hands, and she read it again. Her father had been careful after all. He had been careful in the one place she hadn't thought to look, with the one person she hadn't known to ask. He had known. He had known about Margaret, or suspected or feared, and he had taken one careful step that his second wife had never found. Clara pressed the letter against her chest, and she did the thing she had not done once since the night in the Whitmore kitchen with the scissors at her neck. She cried. She cried without sound, because she had learned long ago how to cry without making a sound, and she cried for her father, who had tried to protect her, and for herself, who had been so certain she was entirely without protection, and she cried for the 2 years of cold mornings and threadbare dresses, and the particular loneliness of being invisible in your own home. She cried for about 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, folded the letter, and put it carefully in the lining of her mother's apron with the other letters. Then she stood up and went back to work. She showed it to Nathaniel that evening. She handed it to him across the desk without preamble and watched him read it, and she watched his face as he read it. The careful, even face, the eyes that moved steadily down the page, and she saw the moment he got to the third paragraph. Something shifted. Subtle. The set of his jaw. He looked up at her. "He planned it," Nathaniel said. "He planned it," she confirmed. A pause. "All right," Nathaniel said. He set the letter on the desk and placed his hand flat on it in a gesture that was almost, she wouldn't call it tender. That wasn't the right word for him, but particular. Deliberate. "Then we have everything we need." "Not quite," Clara said. "We have the documents. We have Garrett. We have Harlan Webb if he'll testify. We have the recorder's filing. We still need to present all of it in a way that can't be buried or redirected by anyone Margaret has managed to get on her side." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I've had 2 years to think about it," she said. He leaned back in his chair. The lamplight was behind him, and she couldn't read his expression with full precision, but she could read the shape of what he was thinking, the thoroughness of him working through the same problem she was working through. "The county magistrate," she said. "Mr. Pryor." "He's not in Margaret's pocket," Nathaniel said. "But he's not a brave man. He doesn't need to be brave. He just needs a reason that makes courage the easier choice." She paused. "If the documents are presented publicly somewhere where he cannot quietly put them aside, he won't have an option." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "The summer gathering," he said. She nodded. It was the largest community event of the year in 3 counties. Every prominent family attended. Every man who held any county position attended. There was no room at the summer gathering to quietly redirect anything, because everyone was watching, and the social stakes were too high for anyone to risk being on the wrong side of what was clearly documented. "Margaret will be there," Clara said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Eleanor will be there." "Yes. It needs to happen there," Clara said. "In front of everyone. Not because I want—" She stopped. "Not for the satisfaction of it, but because that's the only venue where the truth is harder to suppress than the lie." He was watching her. She met his eyes. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know it puts your name in the middle of it. I know that's not a small thing." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think I don't know whose side of this I'm on?" She held his gaze. "I am entirely aware," he said, "of whose side I'm on." Clara breathed out slowly. She thought this man. She thought I did not expect this man. She looked at the letter on his desk at his hand still resting flat on it. And she thought about her father saying, "The Whitmore land is yours. Don't let anyone tell you different." And she thought I haven't. I didn't. "All right," she said. "The summer gathering then." 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks. He picked up the pen. She stood and walked toward the door, and she was almost through it when he said without looking up from whatever he was writing, "Clara." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name, not Miss Whitmore. Clara. She waited. "You're not a ward," he said, still writing. "You're not a charity case. You're not a woman who came here to be endured or managed or placed at the bottom of a ladder." He paused. "I want to make sure you know that's how I see it." She stood in the doorway. "I know," she said softly. "I'm starting to." She walked out into the hallway, and the evening had gone quiet outside, just the sound of the farm settling into night, and Clara stood for a moment and let herself feel it. Not the fear, not the grief, not the weight of 2 years, but the particular unfamiliar lightness of a thing that has been in the dark for a long time and is finally being asked to step into the light. She let herself feel it. Then she went and made sure the morning fire was laid. That was who she was. And tonight, for the first time, that felt like something worth being. 6 weeks was both a long time and no time at all. Clara knew this the way she knew most things, by living inside of it. The days were full. She made sure they were full, because full days left less room for the particular kind of fear that crept in at the edges of idle hours. She managed the kitchen. She tended Tom's knee. She taught Hattie how to make proper preserves from the summer fruit. She kept the household accounts with the precision of a woman who had learned early that numbers did not lie the way people did. And every evening, when the farm had gone quiet and the last of the supper dishes were put away, she would take out her mother's apron and unfold the letters inside it and read them again. Not because she needed to. She had them memorized by now, every word, every stroke of her father's left-handed script. But reading them reminded her that this was real, that it had happened, that she was not inventing a wrong that did not exist. She needed that reminder more than she expected, because 6 weeks was also enough time for doubt to start whispering. It whispered in the voice of Margaret, rational, smooth, practiced. It said, "Who will believe you?" It said, "You're a girl with no standing and no money, and a handful of old papers going up against a woman who has spent 2 years building alliances and establishing herself in 2 counties. It said, "Garrett is old and cautious and may lose his nerve." It said, "Harlan Webb is afraid, and fear is more reliable than loyalty." It said, "Even if every document holds, even if every witness speaks, there is still a magistrate who is not a brave man standing between you and what is yours." Clara did not answer the whisper. She had learned that answering it gave it power it didn't deserve. She simply worked and waited and trusted in Nathaniel Carter's particular brand of patience. And she watched Eleanor. Eleanor had come back twice in the 6 weeks since her first visit. Both times with Mrs. Pryor. Both times in the late afternoon when Nathaniel was likely to be in or near the house. Both times with the specific and transparent purpose of inserting herself into his daily life in ways small enough to seem natural. She was very good at it. Clara had to admit that. Eleanor moved through a room the way water moved through a landscape, finding every low place, every gap, every point of least resistance. She laughed at the right moments, and went quiet at the right moments, and asked questions about the farm that were just informed enough to suggest genuine interest. She was performing, yes, but she was performing skillfully. What she could not perform was not knowing Clara was there. Every time in both visits, Eleanor's performance had the same flaw. It was small, the kind of small that most people would miss. But Clara had spent years reading Clara Whitmore, and she saw it every time. A tightening at the corner of the mouth when Clara walked into a room. A fractional stiffening of the shoulders. A redirection of conversation that happened just a half-second too quickly. Eleanor was afraid of her. That was new. Clara turned that knowledge over in her mind, and found it steadying. She said nothing about it to Nathaniel. She did not need to. He was watching too. It was Hattie of all people who brought the first real warning. 2 weeks before the summer gathering, Hattie came into the kitchen in the morning with her gap-toothed grin absent and something tight and unhappy in its place, and she set down the bucket she was carrying and said without looking up, "I heard something at the market yesterday." Clara looked at her. "Sit down, Hattie." Hattie sat. "I wasn't going to tell you, but I think you should know." "Tell me." "Mrs. Barnett. She's the wife of the tanner on the South Road. She talks to everyone. She said that there's a story going around. About you." Hattie picked at the edge of the table. "About why you left Kentucky." Clara kept her hands flat on the table. "What kind of story? That you were—" Hattie stopped. Tried again. "That you had a man at the Whitmore farm. That something happened with a man. That's why you left." She said it fast, and then looked up with her eyes full of apology. "I know it ain't true. I know who you are. But people are saying it, and I thought you should—" "Margaret," Clara said. Not a question. Hattie nodded miserably. "I reckon." Clara breathed through her nose. She sat with it for a moment, the deliberate, calculated ugliness of it, the specific nature of the lie chosen. Not theft, not incompetence, not temper or laziness, or any of the acceptable flaws that could be forgiven in time. Something that could not be unsaid. Something that adhered to a woman like a mark. Margaret had decided the summer gathering was coming, and she needed better weapons. "Thank you," Clara told Hattie, "for telling me. What are you going to do?" "What I always do," Clara said. "Work." But she went to Nathaniel within the hour. She told him plainly, standing in the study doorway, what Hattie had reported. She told him without editorializing, without the tremble she could feel at the back of her throat, without asking him anything. She just told him because he needed to know, and because she had learned in these weeks that he was a man who dealt best with facts stated directly. When she finished, the quality of his stillness changed. It changed the way weather changes, same air, different pressure. He was sitting at his desk, and he did not move, but something in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw shifted into something very controlled and very cold. "She's afraid," he said. "Yes," Clara said. She wouldn't be doing this if she wasn't afraid. He looked at her. That means what we have is enough to make her afraid. That's important. I know, Clara said. I'm not shaken by it, Mr. Carter. I want you to know that. I'm angry, but I'm not shaken. He looked at her for a long moment. I know you're not, he said, and the way he said it, even certain like stating something that had long since been established, did more for her than anything sympathetic would have done. She's going to be at the gathering, Clara said. And whatever she's been telling people, she'll have told them by then. I'll walk in, and half the county will have heard some version of it. Yes. That might work against... It might, he said. Or it works for us. She looked at him. She's showing her hand, he said. She's scared enough to spread that kind of story 2 weeks before a public event where she knows documentation is coming. That's desperation, Clara. Mistakes. He paused. We don't give her time to make more. We move the timeline. The gathering is in 2 weeks. I'm not talking about the gathering. He picked up his pen. I'm talking about Harlan Webb. I need to ride to Kentucky. Now, tomorrow. He was already writing. She's trying to change the story because she knows the document story is already compromised. That means she's heard something from someone at the recorder's office, or from Garrett's end, or from Webb himself. She's preemptive. We need Webb's account before she gets to him again. Clara's stomach tightened. If he won't talk. He'll talk, Nathaniel said. Leave Webb to me. He said it without arrogance. He said it the way he said everything, as a plain assessment of a practical reality. And Clara, who had spent 2 years in a house where certainty was wielded against her, found this particular certainty entirely different in character. She found it, in fact, something close to beautiful. All right, she said. When will you be back? 5 days, he said. 6 at most. Mrs. Calloway runs this house as well without me as with me. You know that. I'm not worried about the house. He looked up from his writing. She held his gaze. I'm not a woman who worries about practical things when they're under control, she said. I'm telling you, come back. Something moved in his expression. I intend to, he said. I was gone 4 days. 4 days in which Clara ran the Carter household with her usual precision and did not sleep well and did not say so to anyone, and in which the whisper that she had been managing for 6 weeks grew louder in the empty hours before the fire needed building. It said, what if he goes to Kentucky and finds that Harlan Webb has already been pressured into silence? What if the testimony collapses? What if the solicitor has lost his nerve? What if Margaret has more allies than they knew? What if the gathering comes, and the documents are challenged, and the story she's been spreading has done its work, and Clara Whitmore stands in front of the whole county, with nothing but her own word, against a woman who has spent 2 years systematically dismantling the value of Clara's word? She did not answer these questions. She built the fire. She made the bread. She tended Tom's knee, and helped Hattie with the preserves, and sat with Mrs. Calloway in the evenings, and listened to the older woman talk about the years before Nathaniel came back from the war, the state of the land, then how long it had taken to become what it was. He built all of this, Mrs. Calloway said one evening, not with particular sentiment, just with the accuracy of someone reporting something real. He came back, and there wasn't much left, and he built all of it back. Just worked. Didn't talk about it, didn't make a story of it. Just put one thing right after another. Clara thought about that. He doesn't talk much about the war. No, Mrs. Calloway said. Men like him don't. What happened to him over there? Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment. He lost someone, she said. A man he was close to. Took it hard in the way that quiet men take things hard all the way through nothing on the surface. She glanced at Clara. He was a different man when he came back. Not worse, but closed. Clara looked at her hands. He's less closed than he was, Mrs. Calloway said, and then turned back to her mending with the focused attention of a woman who had said exactly as much as she intended to say. He came back on the 4th evening. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard. She heard Mrs. Calloway's voice, then Nathaniel's, and she very deliberately did not go to the door. She finished what she was doing and waited. He came to the kitchen doorway. One look at his face told her enough. "He talked," she said. "He talked," Nathaniel confirmed. He came fully into the kitchen and sat down at the table, something she had never seen him do before. Sit in the kitchen, and he looked like a man who had ridden a long way and was still working through what he'd found at the end of it. "Webb was ready to break," Nathaniel said. "Margaret had sent a man to him 3 days before I got there. Told him there would be trouble for his family if he said anything at the gathering. Told him Clara Whitmore was a girl of questionable character and that testifying on her behalf would associate his name with—" He stopped. "With the story she's been spreading." Clara said nothing. "I was going to stay quiet," Nathaniel said. "Had made up his mind. He told me so straight out, sat across from me in his house, and told me he was sorry, but he couldn't afford the trouble." "What changed his mind?" Nathaniel looked at her. "I told him your father's name." She went still. "I told him Robert Whitmore had filed a will 6 months before he died, and kept it with a solicitor specifically because he was afraid his wife would destroy it. I told him the land records showed 2 filings, one made by Robert Whitmore himself and one made by someone else afterward. I told him what that meant." He paused. "And then I told him that Robert Whitmore had trusted him, that he'd worked that land beside him for 22 years, and he'd trusted him with the truth of that house, and that this was the one moment where that trust either meant something or it didn't." Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. "He cried," Nathaniel said quietly. "He's not a young man. He put his hands over his face, and he cried, and then he wiped his face off, and he looked at me, and he said, 'I will be at the gathering.'" The kitchen was entirely silent. Clara breathed in and out carefully, and she thought about Harlan Webb, who had known her father for 22 years, and had been afraid, and had been threatened, and had still in the end chosen correctly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice held. Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, as though he was reading something she wasn't aware of writing, and then he said, "Your father was a good man." "Yes," she said. "He was." "A beat. The documents hold," Nathaniel said. "Garrett will testify in writing, if not in person. He wrote me a full affidavit witnessed and sealed. The original will is authenticated. The recorder's office has filed a formal discrepancy notice on the estate transfer, and Webb will stand up in front of whoever needs to hear it and say what he heard." He laid it out plainly. Each piece. Each verified, solid, irrefutable piece. Clara listened to each one and felt something in her chest assembling itself. Not triumph, not yet, but the shape of something that could become triumph. The architecture of a truth that had been buried and was now piece by careful piece being dug back out. "One more thing," Nathaniel said. Something in his tone made her look at him more sharply. "I stopped at the county recorder's office on the way back," he said. "There's something I didn't know before. Something my contact found when he went back through the original filing." He paused. "The second will the forged one Margaret filed after your father died, the witness signatures." "What about them?" "One of the witnesses is a man named Aldous Crane," he said. "He's a local magistrate in your county in Kentucky. He's been on the bench there for 6 years. Clara stared at him. "If he witnessed that document," she said slowly, "and the document is a forgery, then he either witnessed a fraud knowingly," Nathaniel said, "or his name was forged onto it without his knowledge." "Which is it?" "I don't know yet." His eyes were direct. "But I will before the gathering." Clara felt the shape of it shift under her feet. Not unstable, more like ground that was larger than she'd mapped. Margaret had not just forged a will. She had either corrupted or implicated a sitting magistrate. Either way, that changed the weight of what was coming. "She didn't just steal the farm," Clara said. "No," Nathaniel said. "She committed fraud against a county legal proceeding. That's not a civil matter anymore, Clara. That's criminal." The word sat in the kitchen between them. Criminal. Clara let it settle. Let the full measure of it land. Then she said, "Does Pryor know?" "Not yet." "He will," she said. "He'll have to. If his colleague's name is on a forged document. He'll want to know before the gathering," Nathaniel said. "Which means we tell him privately, before Margaret has a chance to reach him first." Clara nodded. Her mind was moving fast now, faster than she usually let it move in front of people, cataloging and organizing and mapping the sequence of what needed to happen and when. "How much time do we have?" she asked. 10 days, he said. "We need to see Pryor within 3. I'll send word tomorrow morning. And Eleanor?" Clara stopped. Thought. "Eleanor doesn't know the extent of what her mother did. I don't think she does. She's not. Eleanor is vain and selfish, and she's been her mother's instrument her whole life. But she's not the one who made the plan." Nathaniel watched her. "That matters," Clara said. "Not for sympathy, but practically. If Eleanor is shown the truth before the gathering, if she understands what her mother actually did, not just the social maneuvering, but the criminal fraud, she may not stand beside her." "You want to tell Eleanor," Nathaniel said. "I want her to know what she's defending," Clara said, "before she has to defend it in public." He was quiet for a moment. "That's more generous than she deserves." "It's not generosity," Clara said. "It's strategy. A mother standing alone against documented fraud is a woman who committed a crime. A mother abandoned by her own daughter because the daughter couldn't defend the indefensible. That's a story the county remembers differently." Nathaniel looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while." 2 years, she said. He breathed out something that in a less restrained man might have been a laugh. "All right," he said. "We see Pryor in 3 days. I'll arrange for Eleanor separately." He paused. "You'll be there." "For Pryor." "For Eleanor," he said. "It should come from you." She thought about that. About sitting across from Eleanor Whitmore and laying out the truth of what Eleanor's mother had done, not as accusation, not as revenge, but as plain fact, asking her in effect to choose. "She won't like it," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "But she's not stupid. You said so yourself." "I said she wasn't stupid. I didn't say she was brave." "Finding out you've been used by the person you trusted most," Nathaniel said quietly, "tends to be its own kind of education." Clara thought of Margaret. Of 2 years believing that hard work and silence and not fighting back would eventually be enough. Of learning slowly and at great cost that some people did not respond to goodness because goodness was not what they were after. "Yes," she said, "it does." Pryor came to the Carter farm on the 2nd day. He came alone, which Nathaniel had asked him to do, and he sat in the study with the documents in front of him and read through everything without speaking. He was a compact, careful man with the manner of someone who had spent many years making himself easy to underestimate. And he read the way careful men read slowly, going back twice over anything that surprised him. It surprised him more than once. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at Nathaniel and said, "Aldous Crane." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "You're certain his name is on the forged document?" "I have a copy." Pryor looked at the copy. He looked at it for a long time. "He won't have known," he said finally. "Aldous wouldn't have. He's a fool, but he's not a criminal. She must have used his name without—" "That's our assumption as well," Nathaniel said. "Which means he's a victim of this as much as Clara." Pryor looked at Clara. She had sat quietly through the reading on the chair near the window, and she held his gaze without flinching. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology." She had not expected that. "Sir, my wife introduced Miss Whitmore's daughter to this household," he said, using Eleanor's name precisely in a way that separated her from the woman he was discussing. "I didn't know the full circumstance. I should have. It was my business to know, and I didn't make it my business." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." Clara looked at him. She thought of all the things she could say to that. She thought of 2 years of being nobody, and the way that nobodiness had depended in part on men like Pryor, simply not looking closely enough. "You're looking now," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded once, a short decisive nod. "I'll be at the gathering," he said, "and I will not be looking away." Eleanor came on the 4th day. She came alone this time, not with Mrs. Pryor, not with any social scaffolding, just herself in a wagon and a dress that was slightly too fine for an afternoon call, and the particular look on her face of a woman who had heard something and was not sure what to do with it. Someone had told her something. Clara could see it immediately. Not the whole truth, she didn't have the whole truth yet, but enough of a piece of it to make her uneasy. They sat in the front room, the three of them, Clara, Eleanor, and Nathaniel, who had positioned himself in the chair to the side in the specific way of a man who was present without presiding. Eleanor looked at the documents on the table between them, and she looked at Clara, and she said, "What is this?" "Sit down, Eleanor," Clara said. "I don't want to sit down. What is—" "Sit down," Clara said again, and there was something in her voice this time, not anger, something more settled than anger, that made Eleanor sit. Clara told her. She told her plainly, the way she had wanted to be told plain things for 2 years. She laid out these documents, the original will, the forged will, the recorder's discrepancy notice, Garrett's affidavit. She explained without embellish what each one meant and what each one proved. She told her about Aldous Crane's name being on the forged document and what that meant legally. She told her about Harlan Webb. She told her all of it. Eleanor's face went through a number of things during the telling. First, the polished composure she had walked in with. Then, as the documents became undeniable, something under the composure, something younger and more confused. Then, when Clara mentioned Crane's name, a blanching that was the response not of guilt, but of genuine shock. She hadn't known. That at least had been true. When Clara finished, Eleanor sat for a long time without speaking. She was looking at her own hands in her lap. "She told me," Eleanor said finally very quietly, "that you had signed something, before your father died, that you had agreed to give over your rights in exchange for being cared for as a dependent." She stopped. "She said you chose it." "I signed nothing," Clara said. "She showed me a document with your—" "She showed you another forgery, Eleanor." Silence. "I know," Eleanor said, even quieter. "I think somewhere I knew. I just—" She stopped again. "She told me what she needed me to believe, and I—" She pressed her hands together. "I let her." Clara looked at this woman who had giggled while scissors cut into her hair, and she thought about what she wanted to feel. She thought about what would be satisfying. About the version of this moment she had rehearsed for 2 years in the dark hours of early morning. Then she looked at Eleanor's face, the genuine unperformed shock of someone discovering that the person they trusted most had used them as an instrument in something real and damaging, and she thought, "We are not the same, Eleanor and I. But this is not entirely what I thought it was either." "Eleanor," she said, "I'm not asking you to testify. I'm not asking you to do anything except not stand in the way of the truth." Eleanor looked up. "At the gathering," Clara said. "Whatever your mother asks you to do, whatever story she asks you to stand behind, don't." "She's my mother," Eleanor said. "I know." "She's—" Eleanor's voice cracked, and then she controlled it hard the way she'd been taught. "What will happen to her?" Clara looked at her honestly. "I don't know exactly. That's for Pryor and the court to determine. What I know is that the documents are real, and they'll be presented, and the truth will be there for everyone to see." She paused. "The only question is whether you're standing next to it or in front of it." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you known about all of it?" "Since the day your mother showed me the will," Clara said. Eleanor's eyes closed. When they opened again, something had changed in them. Not warmth, not yet, maybe not ever, but a kind of exhausted honesty that Clara recognized from her own mirror. "I didn't know about the magistrate," Eleanor said. "I believe you. The things I said to you. What I let her do." She couldn't finish. Clara looked at her. She thought, "I am not ready to forgive you, Eleanor Whitmore." She thought, "I may never be." But she also thought, "This is not the place to say so, and it is not what this moment needs." "Stay home from the gathering," Clara said quietly. "If you can't stand for the truth, at least don't stand against it. That's all I'm asking." Eleanor stood up. Her hands shook slightly, which was the first fully unperformed thing Clara had ever seen her do. She gathered her bag, and she walked to the door, and she paused there with her back to the room. "I'm sorry," she said. For your hair." She walked out before Clara could respond. The room was quiet. Nathaniel had not said a word throughout. He spoke now carefully. That went better than I expected. Or worse, Clara said. I don't know yet which. She's not her mother, he said. No. Clara looked at the documents on the table. She's not. But she let her mother use her, and she let herself not look too closely, and there are consequences to both of those things, even if you didn't plan them. She paused. She'll have to work that out herself. Nathaniel looked at her. You're harder than you look, he said. I'm exactly as hard as I need to be, she said. And no harder. She gathered the documents carefully, the way she gathered everything with precision, with respect for what they represented. 6 days, she said. Let's not waste them. He stood. No, he said. Let's not. Outside the summer was reaching its full heat, pressing in through every window, heavy and relentless. And somewhere in Kentucky, Margaret Whitmore was preparing her own version of the truth, not yet knowing that every piece of the real thing had been found, named, witnessed, and was moving toward the light. Clara straightened the documents in her hands and thought 6 days. She had waited 2 years. 6 days was nothing. 6 days she could hold. The morning of the summer gathering. Clara woke before the fire needed lighting. She lay still for a moment in the dark of her small room and took stock of herself the way she had learned to do, the way a person checks the ground before stepping onto it. Not from fear exactly, but from the habit of someone who had learned that the ground was not always what it appeared. Her hands were steady. That was the first thing she noticed. She had expected them to shake the way they had shaken the night her father pressed those letters into her palm and said, "Don't let anyone tell you different." But they were still. Open flat on the blanket beside her, quiet and ready. She had been ready for 2 years. She dressed without rushing. She braided what there was of her hair. It had grown through the summer, grown enough now to do something with, not long yet, but hers again, fully and completely hers. And she pinned it simply, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she thought, all right, she thought, this is the day. Then she went and built the fire because that was who she was, and the household still needed breakfast. Hattie was up early too, moving with the particular nervous energy of someone who understood that today was different without fully knowing why. She bumped into the doorframe twice and dropped a ladle and apologized 3 times for things that didn't need apologizing for. And Clara put a hand briefly on her shoulder and said, "Settle, Hattie. Breathe." And Hattie breathed. Mrs. Calloway came down dressed in her best, which Clara had not seen before. She looked at Clara across the kitchen, and something passed between them, the wordless acknowledgement of 2 women who understood what was at stake without needing to name it. "You eat something," Mrs. Calloway said. "I will. I don't mean in a bit, I mean now. Before that man comes down and you both start thinking about logistics and forget to be human for the next 12 hours. Clara almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She ate. Nathaniel came down 20 minutes later in the coat he wore for county business. Not fine, but pressed with the bearing of a man who wore authority the way other men wore hats naturally and without thinking about it. He looked at Clara, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How are you?" "Ready," she said. He nodded once. "Good." He poured himself coffee, drank it, standing at the hearth, and that was the full extent of their morning conversation, which was exactly what Clara needed. She did not need comfort or encouragement or reassurance. She needed the company of a man who believed the outcome of today was already determined by the truth they were carrying, and who communicated that belief simply by not being afraid. Nathaniel Carter was not afraid. She carried that with her when they left for the gathering. The summer gathering was held on the prior property, 3 acres of flat land along the creek that the county had been using for this purpose for 15 years, long enough that it had become in the minds of everyone who attended the place where the county took its own measure, where reputations were made plain, where the social order asserted itself and could on rare and memorable occasions be rearranged. People came from 40 miles out. Farm families and merchants, and the handful of lawyers and county officials who made the law mean something in a place this far from any city. Women in their summer dresses, and men in their good coats, and children underfoot, and the particular buzzing noise of a community that saw itself clearly only when it gathered. Clara felt the eyes before she saw the faces. She had known they would look. She had prepared for that. What she had not fully prepared for was the specific texture of the looking. Not the open curiosity of people encountering a stranger, but the more careful sideways attention of people who had already been told a story about her and were now revising it in real time against what they actually saw. Margaret had done her work. Clara could feel the residue of it in the air. She could tell the difference between people who had heard nothing and were simply curious, and people who had heard something and were measuring her against it. She had spent 2 years learning to read rooms, and this room, 3 acres of summer heat and social consequence, was readable. She walked through it with her back straight and her face even, and Nathaniel beside her, not touching, not hovering, just there. And she understood what his presence communicated without either of them saying a word about it. The county trusted Nathaniel Carter. Not liked trust was a different thing from liking, and he was not a man who courted liking, but trusted in the bone-deep way that a community trusted someone who had been through the fire and come back and built something real. He had served them in his particular way without asking for anything back. Being at his side said something. He knew it, and she knew it, and the county knew it too. She had not asked him to stand beside her. He had simply done it. Margaret arrived 30 minutes after Clara. She came in a good carriage with 2 women. Clara didn't recognize friends from Lexington by the look of them, brought specifically for this occasion, which told Clara that Margaret had felt the ground shifting and had decided to reinforce her position with new allies who had no context for the documents coming. Clara watched her step down from the carriage. Margaret was a handsome woman. She had always been a handsome woman. That was part of how she had worked that particular handsome confidence that people mistook for substance. She moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who had been preparing for today, the way Clara had been preparing, except that her preparation had been social and performative, where Clara's had been evidentiary. She had not seen Clara yet, or rather, she had not let herself be seen seeing Clara. Clara knew the difference. She watched Margaret work the crowd, the easy conversation, the hand on the arm, the laugh at the right moment. She was doing exactly what she was best at, building in real time a version of herself that the people around her would feel vaguely obligated to protect. Old Tom materialized at Clara's elbow. She startled slightly. "Tom, what are you doing here?" "Couldn't stay away," he said. "My knee's good enough for a day's standing thanks to you." He looked across the gathering at Margaret. "She see you yet?" "She's seen me." "You all right?" "I'm all right, Tom." He nodded. He had a way of nodding that encompassed more than agreement. "Your daddy would have been here," he said. "Just so you know. He'd have been right here." Clara looked at him. She thought, don't cry, not here, not now. She thought, hold it the way she had been holding things her whole life. "I know," she said. "Thank you." Tom tipped his hat, that particular gesture of men who had genuine respect for women, but had no other language for it, and moved off. The first collision happened earlier than Clara had planned. She was near the tables that had been set up along the creek when she heard the voice behind her, and she understood in the half-second before she turned that this was Margaret deciding not to wait. "Clara." She turned. Margaret was 2 feet away, with her Lexington friends bracketing her, and her expression was the one Clara knew best. The composed, faintly concerned face of a woman performing worry so well that it looked like the real thing. "My goodness," Margaret said in a carrying voice. "I'd heard you'd found a position. You look well, you look better than I expected." Around them, conversation slowed. People pretending not to listen who were absolutely listening. Clara looked at Margaret. "Whitmore really looked the way you look at something when you are no longer afraid of it." And she felt the old familiar cold in her chest, and under it something else, something newer, something solid. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Just that. Just her name. Margaret blinked. She had expected more. Clara could see it, the recalibration happening behind those composed eyes. "I've been worried about you," Margaret said. "Truly. A girl in your situation with no family to speak of." "I have family," Clara said. "I have my father's name and my father's land." The air around them went tight. "Your father's land came to me through legal process." Margaret said, still carrying the concerned tone, but with something harder underneath it now. I know you've had trouble accepting that, Clara, but— I've had trouble, Clara said, accepting a forgery. The word landed in the air between them like a stone in still water. The ripples went out. Margaret's composed face went through something just for a half second, just a fracture before it reassembled. I don't know what you think you've— I don't think anything, Clara said. I know what I have. She looked at Margaret steadily. And I think you know what I have too. I think that's why you sent someone to Harlan Webb's house. Margaret went very still. I think that's why you've been telling people stories about why I left Kentucky. Clara continued, her voice even and clear, not raised, not performing, just true. I think you've known for weeks that the documents existed, and you've been running ahead of them, trying to make sure that when the truth arrived, nobody would be willing to believe it. This is— Margaret started. This is a public place, Clara said. And I haven't accused you of anything yet. I've simply told you that I know what you did. She paused. The formal part comes later. She turned and walked away. Her hands were still not shaking. Behind her, she heard Margaret say something to her friends in a low, controlled voice, and she heard the particular quality of the silence that had formed around that exchange. Not hostile, not yet, but attentive and shifting. Nathaniel was waiting where she'd left him. He looked at her face. How bad, he said. It started, she said. That's all. It started. Pryor found them an hour later. He came with the particular purposeful walk of a man who had made a decision and was moving to implement it, and he said to Nathaniel, Crane is here. Clara went still. Aldous Crane? Pryor said, looking at her. He rode out this morning when he received my letter. He wants to speak before anything is presented formally. He wants to be clear about his position. What is his position? Nathaniel asked. That he has never seen that document in his life, Pryor said. That his signature is a forgery, and he will state so under any oath required. He paused. He's angry. He's an old man, and his name has been used against his knowledge, and he is significantly angry. Clara thought about the architecture of this. A county magistrate standing up in front of his peers, stating that his name had been placed on a document without his consent. That shifted the weight of what was coming entirely. Margaret had not forged a will and outmaneuvered a grieving daughter. She had committed fraud against an officer of the county. Where is he? Nathaniel said. By the Pryor house. He wants to speak to Miss Whitmore directly. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Go, he said. I'll find Webb. Aldous Crane was shorter than she'd imagined from the weight his name carried in documents. He was 70 if he was a day, with a white beard and the square-set jaw of a man who had spent decades being taken seriously and did not intend to stop now. He looked at Clara when she approached and said without any introduction, You're Robert Whitmore's daughter. Yes, sir, she said. How is a decent man, Crane said. I knew him from county business years back. Honest man. He looked at her steadily. My name is on a document I never saw. I want you to know that I will not permit that to stand. I know you didn't sign it, sir. I know you know, he said. I want you to know that I will say so, publicly, wherever it needs to be said. He paused. The woman who did this, I don't know what she expected. That no one would look. That a man's name could be placed on a fraudulent document, and he'd simply not notice. He shook his head. I have been on the bench of this county for 6 years. My signature means something. Yes, sir, Clara said. It does. He looked at her for a moment longer. Your father kept a copy of his will with Garrett, he said. That was smart. That was a man who didn't trust what was coming. He tried to protect me. He did, Crane said. And we're going to make sure it counted. He held out his hand. Clara shook it. She had shaken very few hands in her life. It was not something women were generally invited to do. But she shook Aldous Crane's and felt the weight of it. The particular significance of a man's formal word extended in that way to a woman who had been treated like she had no standing. She had standing now. The formal presentation happened in the early afternoon, when the gathering had reached its fullest, and the community was settled and fed, and the particular social ease of a summer afternoon had made everyone slightly less guarded than they'd been at arrival. Pryor called it to order, the way he called most things to order, without drama, with the authority of his position and the particular directness of a man who had decided to be brave and was not going to permit himself to be anything else. He stood, and he said that there was a matter of county record that required community attention, and that it concerned the estate of the late Robert Whitmore of Kentucky. Clara felt the shift in the air before she heard the reaction. She felt Margaret go still somewhere behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it. She knew the particular quality of Margaret's stillness, the way she knew the weather. Pryor laid it out in the clean procedural language of a man who had been in county law long enough to know that plain language was more devastating than dramatic language. He presented the documents. He summarized the recorder's findings. He introduced Garrett's affidavit, read by a county clerk in a steady voice that carried across the gathering without elevation or performance. Then he called Harlan Webb. Harlan Webb was 60 years old, and he walked like a man carrying something heavy, and when he reached the front and turned to face the gathering, he found Clara first in the crowd, and he looked at her, and she gave him the smallest possible nod, and he breathed out and turned to face the people. He said what he had heard. Robert Whitmore's voice in the bedroom of his own house 6 weeks before his death, saying the land belongs to Clara. He said it plainly and completely, and his voice only broke once at the end, when he said he made me promise to remember. He said someone might try to tell her different. The gathering was very quiet. Then Crane stood up. He did not wait to be introduced. He stood and he turned, and he said in the voice of a man who had been on a county bench for 6 years and intended to be on it for 6 more. My name appears on a forged document. I am here to tell every person in this county that I have never seen that document, and I did not sign it, and I am prepared to swear to that in any court required. He sat down. The gathering erupted. Not in anger, not exactly, but in the particular noise of a community, recalibrating many conversations, igniting at once the sound of people looking at each other and arriving at the same conclusion from different starting points. Clara stood in the middle of it, and she breathed, and she looked straight ahead, and she thought about her father's letters folded in her mother's apron, and she thought about Nathaniel asking who did this to you on an afternoon in early summer, and she thought about 2 years of cold mornings and threadbare dresses and the scissors at her neck, and she thought, this is what it sounds like when the truth comes back. She heard Margaret before she saw her. Margaret's voice cut through the noise, still controlled, still composed, but with a new edge in it that Clara had never heard before, the edge of a person whose constructed world was coming apart in real time. This is fabricated, Margaret said. She was standing 10 feet away, and people had made a small space around her, the way people make space around something that might be dangerous. These documents were produced by a girl with a grievance and a wealthy man who took her in and gave her resources to pursue it. This is a campaign of defamation. Mrs. Whitmore, Nathaniel's voice. He had come up beside Clara without her hearing him, and now he stepped forward, not dramatically, just the one step forward of a man making clear where he stood, and he looked at Margaret and he said, "The documents were authenticated by the county recorder's office. The affidavit was written by your late husband's own solicitor. The witness was a man who worked your husband's land for 22 years and heard him speak in his own voice." He paused. "The magistrate whose name appears on your document is standing 20 feet away, saying he never signed it," he said. "I don't know what you thought was going to happen today, but this is what's happening." Margaret looked at him, then at Clara. The composed face was holding barely with the desperate grip of a woman who had nothing left to hold it with except will. But Clara could see the truth of it. She could see for the first time since she'd known her that Margaret Whitmore was afraid. Not of justice exactly, of being seen. That was what she had feared all along. Not punishment, but visibility. The particular terror of a woman who had built her entire life on controlling the story, finding herself in a moment where the story was no longer hers to control. Clara looked at her stepmother, and she felt she had expected to feel triumph or vindication, or the particular sharp satisfaction of a long-delayed reckoning. She felt some of that. She'd be lying if she said she didn't. But she also felt something she hadn't expected. Something quieter and more complicated, more human than she'd had room to be for 2 years. She felt tired. She felt the weight of every morning she had risen in the dark to light a fire in a house that had been taken from her. She felt the scissors at her neck, and the cold of that kitchen floor, and the 2 years of making herself small and survivable, and the thousands of small moments of endurance that added up to the person standing here right now. She was tired of all of it. She wanted it to be over. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was even, quiet enough that the people nearby leaned in slightly to hear. "I'm not here to destroy you," Clara said. "That's not what this is. I don't want your ruin. I don't want Eleanor's ruin. I want what my father built for me, and I want my name restored, and I want to never again be made to feel like a ghost in my own life." She paused. "That's all." Margaret stared at her. "But the documents are real," Clara said, "and the county has seen them. And what happens next is not mine to decide." Pryor stepped forward. His voice was official now, the county business voice that closed down personal territory and opened legal territory. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, "I'm formally notifying you that the county will be initiating a review of the estate transfer of the late Robert Whitmore's property, with particular attention to the discrepancies in the filing record and the testimony of the witnesses present today. You should arrange for legal representation." Margaret looked at Pryor. She looked at Crane. She looked at Webb, who was still standing where he'd given his testimony, looking at the ground. She looked at Nathaniel. And then she looked at Clara. It was the longest look Margaret had ever given her. Not calculating this time. Not performing. Just looking the way a person looks at something they have spent a long time convincing themselves was less than it was and are now forced to see whole. Then Margaret turned and walked back toward her carriage. The Lexington women followed her in the fluttery, uncertain way of people who had arrived as social armor and were now hoping not to be associated with whatever this had become. The gathering watched them go. And then it began to turn back, not to Clara, not to Nathaniel, not to the drama it had just witnessed, but to itself, the way communities turn back to themselves after a reckoning, recalibrating, quietly adjusting the story it told about itself to accommodate a new true thing. Nathaniel found her by the creek, away from most of the people. She had walked there without quite deciding to, pulled by the need for a few minutes outside the noise of what had just happened. She was standing at the edge of the water, and she heard his footsteps on the bank, and she didn't turn around. "It's done," he said. "The review still has to happen," she said. "Legally. It could take months." "It'll go the way it goes," he said. "You know that. You've always known that." She had. She had known from the moment she'd held Garrett's letter in this room that the outcome was determined, that the only question was the timing. "How are you?" he said. She thought about that. She thought about the question asked in the same tone as the first time he'd asked something like it. "Who did this to you?" Standing at a window on the afternoon, she arrived the tone of a man who saw a wrong thing and named it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel I don't know what I thought, more certain about what comes after." "What comes after," he said, "is that you get your farm back, and whatever you choose to do with it is yours to decide." She turned around. He was closer than she'd realized, not crowding her, just present the way he had been present through all of this, steady and without performance. "And here," she said. She meant the farm. She meant the kitchen and Mrs. Calloway and Hattie and old Tom. She meant the morning fire and the herb garden and the 6 weeks of slowly learning what it felt like to be valued for what she actually was. She meant him, though she didn't say that. He looked at her. And for once the careful, even expression was not quite in place, or rather it was there, but something else was there, too visible underneath it for the first time. Something she recognized from the study, from the evenings at the desk, from the one unguarded moment when he'd said, "I think I may have been too careful." "You don't have to leave," he said. "That's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not saying it the way an employer says it. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him. "You're clear," she said. "I'm not a man who says things twice," he said, "or explains himself much. I know that's a limitation." "It's not a limitation," she said. "It's just who you are." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay," he said, "because this is where—" He paused, choosing the word with the care he gave to everything. "This is where I want to be. And you are—" He stopped again. "You're not a charity case, and you're not someone I took in out of obligation, and you're not a woman. I'm saying this too because I feel I owe you something for what you went through." "I know that," she said. "You're someone I—" He looked at the creek for a moment, then back at her. "I have not had many people in my life that I wanted to keep. I lost the habit of wanting to keep people. And then you arrived with your hair cut off and your face like a door that had been closed for a long time, and you made supper for 14 people with a kitchen you'd never worked in, and you said I know to things I didn't expect you to know, and—" He stopped. I was not a man built for speeches. She could see him running out of the language for this, and she found that she did not need him to find it. She found, in fact, that this was better. This halting, unperformed, entirely honest man, standing at the edge of a creek in the heat of a summer afternoon, running out of words because the words were not sufficient. She understood that. She had been running out of words for this for weeks. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. He breathed out slowly. Something in his shoulders released a fraction barely visible, but she was a woman who noticed small things, and she noticed that. She turned back to the water for a moment, looked at it. Let herself be here fully in this moment, without the weight of what was behind it, or the uncertainty of what was ahead. 2 years of nothing, and then all of this all at once, the truth restored, and a man who meant what he said, and land that was hers, and a name that was hers, and the particular new terrifying possibility of a future she had stopped letting herself imagine. She thought my father kept his promise. She thought I kept mine. She thought what comes after is mine to decide. She turned back to Nathaniel. "I'm not leaving," she said. He nodded. Once the way he nodded when something was settled. And Clara Whitmore, who had spent 2 years making herself small and survivable and quiet, stood in the summer afternoon on the bank of a creek in Tennessee, and felt something in her chest open slowly, carefully, the way a door opens that has been closed a long time, and she let it. She let it. The days after the gathering moved differently. Clara noticed it the way she noticed most things, not all at once, but in accumulation in the small details that added up to a truth larger than any single piece. The farmhands who had always been respectful tipped their hats with something additional, now something that was closer to recognition than courtesy. Mrs. Calloway stopped watching her with that particular careful attention of a woman waiting to see whether someone would hold, and started watching her the way you watch someone you have simply accepted. Hattie, who had never been capable of subtlety about anything, told her directly on the 3rd morning after the gathering. "Everybody knows what you did, and everybody knows you didn't make a scene of it. That's what they're talking about, that you didn't make a scene." Clara looked at her over the bread she was shaping. "I wasn't there to make a scene." "I know," Hattie said. "That's the point." The county was talking. Clara had known it would, she had counted on it, in fact had understood from the beginning that the summer gathering was the venue precisely because what happened there became the story. The county told itself. She had understood that truth presented in public became harder to revise than truth presented in private. She had understood all of it with the strategic clarity of a woman who had spent 2 years with nothing to do but plan and wait. What she had not planned for was how it would feel afterward. How the days would feel without the forward pressure of a goal driving them. How it felt to wake up in the morning without the gathering on the horizon, like a fixed point she was navigating toward. It felt unfamiliar. Not empty, but open in a way she had not experienced in so long that she had forgotten what open felt like. She managed it the way she managed everything. She worked. She kept moving. She let the open feeling be there without trying to fill it prematurely. And she waited for what came next. What came next arrived in the form of a letter from the county court, 8 days after the gathering. Pryor's office had moved with a speed that Clara suspected had something to do with Crane's anger, and Nathaniel's name, and the particular urgency of a county official whose colleague's forged signature was at the center of a public fraud case. The letter was formal procedural, the kind of document that contained enormous weight in language deliberately stripped of drama. It informed Clara Whitmore that the review of the estate of Robert Whitmore had been completed, that the original will filed by Garrett had been accepted as the valid and authentic document, that the subsequent filing had been found to be fraudulent and was being referred for criminal proceedings, and that the property and assets of the Whitmore farm were hereby restored to their rightful heir. Her name, in formal county language, her name and her father's farm. She read it at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Calloway was there, and Hattie was there, and she read it twice, and then she set it down, and said nothing for a moment, and Mrs. Calloway poured her a cup of coffee without being asked, and Hattie sat down across from her and waited with unusual patience. "It's done," Hattie said. "It's done," Clara said. Hattie made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, covered her mouth with both hands, and then got up and went to stir something on the fire that didn't need stirring because she was 15 and did not yet know what to do with big feelings except move. Clara held the letter, and she thought about her father's voice, and she thought about the letters in her mother's apron, and she thought about the long, cold mornings, and the threadbare dress, and the scissors, and she thought about all of it. Let herself think about all of it for exactly as long as it took to drink the cup of coffee Mrs. Calloway had given her. Then she folded the letter and put it carefully with the others. Then she went to find Nathaniel. I was in the yard, talking with one of the farmhands about something related to the fence line on the south pasture, the kind of practical ground-level conversation. He had 6 times a day, the ongoing management of a large working property that never stopped requiring attention. He saw her coming, and he read her face before she reached him, and he said to the farmhand, "We'll finish this later." And the man nodded and moved off without requiring any explanation. Clara handed him the letter. He read it, standing up, the way he read most things, with the focused stillness of a man who gave his full attention to whatever was in front of him. She watched his face as he read, and she saw the moment he reached the key paragraph, a slight, almost imperceptible relaxing of his jaw. He handed it back. "All right," he said. She almost laughed. Just that all right in the tone of a man for whom this confirmed what he had always believed was true. "That's it," she said. "All right. What else would I say?" "Something," she said. "Something with more words." He looked at her. "It's right," he said. "It was always going to be right once the truth was in front of people who couldn't ignore it. I'm not surprised. I'm glad it's formal. There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "There is." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "What are you going to do?" he said. She had been thinking about this since she'd read the letter. She had been thinking about it in some form or another. Since the night she'd walked out of the Whitmore farm in the dark, with a single bag and 3 coins sewn into an apron. "I need to go back," she said. "Not to live, but to go back. To see it." She paused. "I need to stand on that land and understand that it's mine, that it's real. I need to do that before I can decide what comes after." Nathaniel nodded. "When?" "Soon. A few days." She looked at him. "I'd like—" She stopped, started again. "Would you come?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, simply, completely without qualification, the same way he said everything that mattered. They rode to Kentucky 4 days later. It was a 2-day journey done in stages, and they rode mostly in the companionable quiet that had become their natural register over the past weeks. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had enough between them that words weren't always necessary. Mrs. Calloway had packed provisions with the thoroughness of a woman sending 2 people into the world and wanting them fed. Hattie had hugged Clara at the door briefly and fiercely, and then gone red in the face, and retreated back into the kitchen. They stayed at an inn the first night in separate rooms, with the propriety of 2 people who understood that what was between them had not yet been named in any formal way, and did not need to be rushed. Clara lay awake for a while. She thought about what she would feel when she saw the farm. She had spent 2 years being afraid of what the farm meant, afraid of the grief in it, the loss, the 2 years of wrong layered over every room her father had built. She had not until now let herself think about what it would mean to stand there as its rightful owner. She thought about it now. She fell asleep before she found the words for it. The Whitmore farm looked smaller than she remembered. She had known it would. It always worked that way. The places that had loomed large in your childhood, in your fear, in your memory. They always revealed their actual dimensions when you returned with enough ground between yourself and what had happened there. The house was still the house her father had built. Solid, a working house built for people who used it rather than displayed it. Margaret was gone. She had known that too. Pryor had told Nathaniel that Margaret had left the county the week after the gathering under the pressure of the forthcoming criminal review and the particular social devastation of being publicly exposed in a community small enough that there was nowhere to hide. She had gone back to Lexington, where her original connections were, where people didn't know the story yet, and she had room to construct a new version of herself. Eleanor had gone with her. Clara had expected to feel more about that. She thought she'd feel the particular ache of something unresolved. The conversation with Eleanor in Nathaniel's front room had ended in apology and uncertainty, and she had not heard from Eleanor since. She had wondered if she would. Standing at the gate of her father's farm, she found she felt not resolved exactly, but released. The way you feel when you finally set down something heavy you've been carrying so long you stopped noticing the weight. Harlan Webb was waiting. He came out of the barn when he heard the horses moving with the careful gait of a man whose age had settled into his joints, and he stopped when he saw Clara, and he took off his hat, and he held it in both hands, and he looked at her. "Miss Clara," he said. "Harlan," she said. He looked at her the way he had looked at her father, she thought, with the particular steadiness of a man who had made his choice and was not going to look away from the consequences of it. "I'm sorry," he said. "For how long I waited to say what needed saying." "You said it when it mattered," she said. "Should have said it sooner." "Maybe," she said. "But you said it. That's what I'm standing here because of." He nodded. The hat turned in his hands. "Your daddy would be—" He stopped. "Well, he'd be something." "Yes," she said. "He would." She walked past him into the yard. She walked to the house, and she opened the door, unlocked, as it had always been unlocked, because her father had said a man who locks his door is a man afraid of his neighbors, and she stepped inside. Nathaniel stayed in the yard. She hadn't asked him to. He simply understood the way he understood most things that mattered, that this was something she needed to do alone. She walked through every room. She did it slowly and deliberately, the way you do something you have been waiting to do for a long time and don't want to rush now that it's finally in front of you. She walked through the kitchen where she had learned to cook at her mother's elbow. She walked through the back room where her father had kept his accounts and where Margaret had sat across from her 2 years ago and shown her a document with a forged signature. She walked through the front parlor where her mother had dried wildflowers and where Eleanor had sat with scissors. She stood in that parlor for a long time. She thought about everything that had happened in this room. She thought about the woman she had been sitting in that chair 22 alone without a single person in the world on her side, trying to hold herself together by the force of a promise she'd made when she was 9 years old. She thought about who she was now. She was not a different person. She wanted to be clear with herself about that she was not transformed, not remade, not rescued into some version of herself that hadn't existed before. She was the same person who had built those fires at 4 in the morning and rationed the well water during droughts and nursed sick men back to health and kept her father's accounts and carried his letters in the lining of her mother's apron for 2 years. She had always been this person. That was the thing she had needed to come back here to understand fully in her bones, in a way that would stay with her. She had been this person when they treated her like nobody. And she was this person now. The treatment had not made her. The mistreatment had not unmade her. She had always been exactly who she was. She breathed out slowly in her mother's parlor, in the house her father built on the land that was hers. Then she walked back outside. Nathaniel was standing where she'd left him, talking quietly with Harlan, and he looked up when she came out, and he read her face, and whatever he saw there, whatever the particular quality of her face was in that moment, he simply nodded. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She stood beside him in the yard and looked at the farm, and she let herself feel all of it, the grief that would always be in it, the loss of her father, the 2 years, the weight of every morning she hadn't expected to have to carry alone. She let herself feel it, and she did not look away from it. And then she let herself feel the other thing too, the solid, real, undeniable fact of it being hers. The ground under her feet, and the sky above it, and the years ahead of her that were hers to decide. "I'm not going to live here," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "I thought I would want to," she said. "Come back here and take it back and live in it. But standing in there—" She paused. "This is my father's house. It will always be my father's house. I don't want to live in the house he built after what was done in it. I want to—" She thought about how to say it. "I want to make something that's mine, not something reclaimed from someone else's damage, something new." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "What will you do with it?" he said. "Harlan can manage it," she said. "He's managed it through worse. I'll take the income from the land." She paused. "That's mine. The land is mine. But the life I build, that's somewhere else." She looked at him. He looked back at her. She had become over these months very good at reading Nathaniel Carter's face, at reading the particular language of a man who communicated more in the quality of his silences than most people communicated in full sentences. And what she read in his face now was not surprise or relief, or the particular cautious hopefulness of a man who has been afraid to want something. It was something simpler, something more settled, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man who had finally stopped being careful. "Tennessee, then," he said. "Tennessee," she agreed. They rode back on a clear morning, and somewhere on the second day, on a long stretch of road through open country, Nathaniel said without particular preamble, "I'd like to ask you something." Clara looked at him. "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the deliberateness she had come to recognize as respect, not hesitation, the care of a man who meant what he said and was making sure he said it right. "I have not been a man who planned much for the future," he said. "After the war, I didn't see the point in planning for things I didn't believe I'd want." He paused. "I believe I'd want them now. The future, specifically." He looked at her directly. "Specifically with you in it." Clara held his gaze. "I'm not asking you because you're grateful," he said. "I know the difference, and I'm not asking because you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere to go, now you have the farm and the income, and you could build a life entirely without this conversation. I want you to know I know that." "I know you know that," she said. "I'm asking," he said, "because you're the first person I've known in a very long time who I've wanted to keep knowing. Because you walk into a room, and something in me settles. Because you see things the way I see them, and you say what you mean, and you don't make yourself smaller to fit what other people want you to be, and I have watched you hold yourself together through more than most people are ever asked to hold, and not once lose who you are." He stopped. "That's why I'm asking." The road was quiet around them. Clara thought about the kitchen table, about who did this to you, about the herb garden and the letters, and Harlan Webb's hands over his face. She thought about the study and the 6 weeks of careful, slow building of something neither of them had named. She thought about the creek bank, and "I'm not leaving." She thought about her father saying the Whitmore land is yours, don't let anyone tell you different, and she thought he was talking about more than land. How was talking about this? About knowing your own value so thoroughly that when someone asked you to step into a future alongside them, you could do it not from necessity, not from gratitude, but from a full and clear-eyed choice. She could do that. She was doing it right now. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I'm saying yes, Nathaniel." Something happened in his face. Then something she had not seen before. Something that had been held back for a very long time by the particular caution of a man who had learned not to want too much. It wasn't dramatic. He was not a dramatic man. But it was real, and it was his, and she recognized it because she had been holding the same thing carefully in her own chest for weeks. He reached across the space between their horses, and he took her hand briefly and firmly, and then released it, and they rode on in the particular silence of two people who have just changed everything and are still. They were married in October, when the summer heat had broken and the county had settled into the steady work of autumn. It was a small ceremony. Clara had not wanted. Large had not wanted the gathering crowd version of her own life. She wanted the people who knew the truth of it. Mrs. Calloway and Hattie and Old Tom and Harlan Webb, who rode up from Kentucky and wore his best coat and cried without covering his face this time. Pryor and his wife came. Crane came, which surprised her, and she was glad of it. The minister said the words that ministers said, and Nathaniel stood beside her and said his in the flat, certain tone of a man who meant every syllable, and Clara said hers, and she meant every syllable too, and there was nothing performed in any of it. No audience being played to just two people in front of the people who loved them saying the true thing. After, when the afternoon had grown long and the guests had settled into the kind of easy company that follows something real, Clara slipped away from the gathering and sat on the porch steps alone for a few minutes. She needed that. She always needed a few minutes outside the noise of things to take her own measure. She thought about everything. She thought about what she had survived and what she had found on the other side of surviving it. She thought about how survival itself was not the point. Survival was only the beginning, only the ground floor of a life, and she had spent 2 years confusing endurance for living and was only now learning the difference. She thought about her mother's wildflowers dried and pressed and hung in a parlor that no longer held them. She thought, I will plant wildflowers here, at the Carter farm, her farm now too. She would find the seeds and she would plant them in the spring and she would dry them in the summer and press them and hang them in the house that was hers to make. Small and real. Hers. She heard the door open behind her, and Nathaniel came and sat beside her on the step close enough that his shoulder was against hers. Everybody's looking for you, he said. I know, she said. I needed a minute. He nodded. He understood that about her. She realized from the beginning. They sat together on the step, and the evening settled around them, and she thought, this is what after looks like. Not a grand thing, not a trumpet and a declaration. Just this, the good weight of a shoulder against hers, the knowledge of a future that was real, and hers to build the quiet that belonged to two people who had earned it. Hattie's head appeared around the door. Mrs. Carter, she said, and then looked delighted with herself for saying it. They're wanting to cut the cake and nobody knows where the knife is. Clara stood. I put it in the second drawer on the left, she said. By the candles. Oh. Hattie disappeared. Nathaniel stood too. He held out his hand, and she took it the way she had in part 1, not taking her hand back this time. Ready, he said. She looked at him. At this man who had asked who did this to you on a summer afternoon, and had never from that moment forward looked away. Yes, she said. Harlan Webb rode home to Kentucky the following morning, and he told the story for the rest of his life. He told it the way people tell the stories that mattered to them, not perfectly, not always in the right order, with some details that shifted over the years, the way details do when a story becomes part of someone. But the heart of it never changed. The heart of it was this: Robert Whitmore had built a farm and loved a daughter and kept a promise, even past the point where promises are easy to keep. And that daughter had held herself together through 2 years of being told she was nobody, and she had carried her father's letters in the lining of her dead mother's apron, because it was the one place no one had thought to look, and she had walked into a stranger's house with her hair cut off and her chin up, and had not broken, had not bent, had not become anything other than exactly who she was, and someone had seen her. Finally and completely and without reservation, someone had seen her. That Harlan Webb said was the part that mattered, not the documents or the courtroom or the gathering. The seeing. The particular grace of being seen by someone willing to look. He said Clara Whitmore never believed she was nobody. Not really. Not in the place where you actually believe things. She just needed the world to catch up to what she already knew about herself. And the world eventually did. That is what they did not take from her, could not take, no matter how they tried. Not with forged documents, or threadbare dresses, or scissors in the dark. They could not take the person she was at the center of herself. The person who had been building fires at 4 in the morning since she was 9 years old, who had nursed sick men back to health, and kept honest accounts, and loved her father, and carried his words sewn into an apron for 2 years, because she was not going to let anyone tell her different. She had always known her own value, and now the whole world knew it too.